In one of the most luxurious French restaurants in San Francisco, where every glance weighs your coat and your shoes before your words, a black man in a hoodie walks in. He says nothing loud. He simply asks, quietly, for a table for one. Less than 10 minutes later, he is refused, insulted, and has a glass of wine thrown in his face. No one asks his name. They only look at his skin color and his clothes, and pass judgment. But as he wipes his face and quietly takes a seat, no one realizes, the entire room is about to pay the price. And the man they dismissed, is the one they will all soon bow to. You think he's just another guest who doesn't belong? Don't look away. The truth will shock you even more. Le Meridian Prime stood modestly yet proudly on the front edge of Market Street, the bustling, expensive heart of San Francisco. More than a French restaurant, it was a gathering place for the elite, faces from financial magazines, politicians who had walked red carpets, A-list celebrities, and the kind of wealthy people no one ever quite knew by name. From the outside, it looked unassuming, but inside, every detail screamed luxury: Italian silverware, French crystal glasses, and the soft scent of jasmine floating from a discreet built-in diffuser system. On Saturday nights, it turned into an unspoken gala. Every table was full. No one raised their voice, yet every eye silently tracked who sat with whom, who claimed the VIP tables, who wore which designer label. Pale gray suits, silk bow ties, elegantly cut gowns, and stiletto heels tapping lightly on polished marble floors. In the middle of it all, Richard Collins, the restaurant's manager, moved between tables like a judge at a competition. Almost no one knew his name, but everyone recognized him. Swiss watch, classic tie knot, sharp eyes, always upright posture, and an ever-cold gaze. To Richard, Le Meridian Prime wasn't just a workplace. It was his stage. And he was the director, every detail had to be flawless. Just a week ago, that stage had nearly collapsed. A group of young guests had come in wearing t-shirts and flip-flops, snapping photos for Instagram. A fashion editor caught wind of the image and published a scathing piece mocking the branding crisis of high-end dining. Richard wasn't fired, but was summoned for a private meeting with the regional CEO. Since then, he'd been twice as tense. Any guest who didn't meet the standard was swiftly turned away. And on this very evening, while Richard was checking the lighting in the VIP area, the glass doors spun open. No announcement. No name on the reservation list. No polished entrance befitting the upper class. Kofi walked in. He was tall, with dark skin, broad shoulders, and a style that clashed with everything around him: a plain black hoodie, simple jeans, and clean white sneakers that didn't belong to any luxury brand. He didn't slouch. He didn't puff up his chest. He simply walked steadily toward the front desk, calm and assured. At the reception stood a young hostess, recently off probation. She looked slightly unsettled but kept her professional smile. Kofi smiled back, gave a polite nod, and said, "A table for one, please. Anywhere is fine." His voice was low and warm. There was no demand in it. No air of superiority. Everything about him was measured, quiet, more polite, in fact, than many already seated in the VIP section. The hostess hadn't yet asked his name when Richard appeared. Somehow, he was already there within seconds. Perhaps he had spotted Kofi on the security cameras. Perhaps he was always watching for anything that didn't fit. Richard approached, his gaze cold as steel. He didn't greet him. Didn't smile. Didn't make eye contact. Instead, his eyes moved slowly from Kofi's hood to his sneakers, scanning him like an object. His face was tight. He didn't show expression, but didn't hide judgment either. Then, in a flat, chilly voice, he said, "I'm sorry, but the restaurant has a strict dress code. Sportswear isn't allowed." The air froze. The hostess lowered her eyes and said nothing. A few guests nearby looked up briefly. Kofi didn't flinch. He didn't frown. He didn't argue. His eyes, calm, deep, and still as the bottom of the ocean, said everything. And no one in that restaurant knew. What they were witnessing was just the beginning. Kofi remained at the reception desk. His shoulders stayed upright, his gaze unwavering. He didn't leave after Richard's cold rejection. He didn't lower his head. There was no trace of anger on his face, only a strange, quiet calm. He looked at Richard and asked, in a deep, steady voice, as if posing a simple, obvious question, "What if I make a reservation right now?" The room seemed to pause for a few seconds. The question was entirely polite, more courteous, even, than many of the guests already seated. But to Richard, it was a challenge. A man like Kofi, with that hoodie, those white sneakers, and skin that didn't match the usual clientele, was standing before him, calmly asking for the right to be served. Richard tilted his head slightly, folded his arms, and stared sharply at Kofi. A thin smile crept onto his lips, not one of kindness, but a carefully wrapped smirk of disdain. "Absolutely not. Dressed like that, you think you belong next to our VIPs." His voice wasn't loud, but loud enough for nearby guests to hear. Several glasses paused mid-air. Glances were exchanged, some sideways, some lingering longer than they should. A white man sitting 2 meters away turned to look Kofi up and down. Around 50, salt and pepper hair, charcoal gray suit, deep red tie. His lips curled, and he added, half laughing as if part of a private joke, "This is a restaurant, not a football field." His companion let out a short chuckle, then returned casually to her wine glass as if nothing had happened. From the bar, a middle-aged woman in a white silk dress turned to glance at Kofi with a mix of surprise and disapproval. She leaned toward her friend and whispered, not too softly, "How did someone like that even get in here?" None of these words were shouted, but they cut deeper than any open insult. They drifted through the air like cold wind, sharp, unseen, but painfully felt. Richard didn't speak again. He merely glanced toward the hostess. A quick, sharp look, enough to issue a silent command. The hostess, face tight with tension and confusion, bowed her head slightly. Her hands trembled. She avoided Kofi's eyes. But Kofi didn't move. He remained still, his gaze fixed on Richard, not resentful, not hostile. Just silently composed. His presence alone made those around him uneasy. He drew a slow breath, and said, "I'm not asking for special treatment. Just respect." His tone was even, unhurried, low. A few heads turned, not out of curiosity, but because they hadn't expected someone like him to remain this composed. Richard scoffed. The contempt was clear in his voice as he shot back, each word like a deliberate wound, "You should go somewhere more suited to your kind." It wasn't a slap, but it landed like one. No need for raised hands, just a few words, enough to build an invisible wall. A line between who was welcome and who was not. Kofi raised his chin slightly. His eyes never left Richard's. He didn't argue. He didn't justify. But something in his gaze stayed, firm, quiet, unforgettable. Then he turned. He didn't leave. He didn't sit. He simply stood there, like a man waiting for something, or someone. The initial silence lasted only a few seconds, but it was enough for tension to settle into the air. From the hallway beside the dining area, 2 men in security uniforms stepped out. Their footsteps were slow and steady, but they carried an invisible weight. They didn't speak. They didn't act threatening. They simply moved forward and stood right behind Kofi. No more than an arm's length away. Their faces were stone cold. One was short and stocky, lips tightly pressed. The other was taller, hand resting near his belt, eyes locked on Kofi's shoulder, like he was waiting for any excuse to act. One of them finally spoke. His voice was deep, even, emotionless. "You're not allowed to stay if you don't follow the rules." It sounded like a rulebook being recited. But underneath was a warning. Authority. The command of a system built to remove people it deemed unfit. Instantly, a middle-aged man at a nearby table slapped the surface, nearly knocking over his wine glass. He turned sharply toward the front desk, his voice sharp with irritation. "Why hasn't he been escorted out yet?" More guests turned their heads. Some pretended not to notice. But the stares toward Kofi were growing, heavier, harder, more direct. From the far right corner of the dining room, a woman in her 50s, wearing a dark purple dress and a string of pearls, swiveled in her chair. Her eyes scanned Kofi from head to toe. Her brow furrowed like she'd just spotted a stain on a white leather seat. Then she leaned toward her friend and muttered just loud enough, "This is uncomfortable." No one intervened. No one spoke up. The entire room sank into a terrifying silence, broken only by the occasional clink of cutlery. And in the middle of it, Richard stood still, then took a decisive step forward. His voice was sharp, precise, cutting through the air like a public decree. "If you don't leave now, I'll call the police." He wasn't trembling. His voice wasn't raised. But his eyes were blazing. Not because Kofi had done anything wrong, but because Kofi dared to remain calm. Dared to stand still. Dared not to bend to rules Richard believed were absolute. Kofi turned around, facing Richard and the two guards head-on. His gaze was not defensive, not aggressive. Just steady. Solid. Silent. As if he were standing in the eye of a storm that couldn't reach him. He replied, in a voice slow, clear, and soft, "I just want dinner. I'm not causing trouble." The room froze again. No one expected that response. No resistance. No begging. Just a simple statement. A basic wish, suddenly too much to ask for in this space. Right then, a young man in a beige shirt walked past behind Kofi. He held a glass of water. With a subtle shift of weight, a perfectly staged accidental slip, the water spilled straight down Kofi's back and shoulders. A few guests gasped. Someone stifled a laugh. The young man quickly turned and faked an apology. "Oh, sorry. Didn't see you there." Kofi paused for a moment. The cold soaked slowly through his hoodie. His back tensed slightly. But instead of reacting, he simply exhaled, reached into his pocket, and pulled out a tissue. He wiped his shoulder. His collar. The center of his chest where water clung. Every movement calm, unhurried. Not flustered. Not shaken. As if he'd long grown used to staged spills, to carefully planned stumbles. No one said anything. No one dared to laugh. The silence grew even thicker than before. And then something, unseen, began to radiate from Kofi. Not anger. Not defiance. But strength. The kind that doesn't speak. A quiet strength. One that made everyone uncomfortable, even though none of them had experienced what he just did. He didn't have to act strong. It was his silence that unsettled them most. You might think the incident would settle after someone spilled water on Kofi, but no. The crowd wasn't satisfied with silence. They couldn't accept that a man like him could stay this calm. And so, one by one, they began to escalate the situation further. In the right-hand corner of the restaurant, a group of sharply dressed young men, clearly from the newly rich class, pulled out their phones. No one stopped them. No one warned them. They raised their cameras, aiming directly at Kofi and laughed as if it were tonight's dinner entertainment. One of them recorded while chuckling, voice mocking, "This is tonight's content, guaranteed to go viral." Laughter echoed softly, blending into the smooth jazz floating from the ceiling speakers. One of them, a guy with an undercut, raised his phone to his ear and exaggerated his voice. "Hello, police, there's a suspicious guy in the restaurant, hoodie, black, not sure if he's armed." His friends burst into louder laughter. One pretended to be scared, clutching the shoulder of the person next to him. Not far from where Kofi stood, a tall, skinny older man in a leather jacket and gray silk scarf walked past. He paused in front of Kofi for half a second, just long enough to tilt his head and spit near Kofi's shoes. It happened so fast, most around them could only blink. The man straightened, completely unfazed. "Oops, slipped." No one responded. No one defended. Kofi looked down at the floor where the spit hadn't yet dried. But he said nothing. Didn't look back. He stood there, posture firm, eyes distant. Near the kitchen, Emily, the youngest server in the restaurant, tightened her grip on a silver tray. Her face had gone pale. Her throat tightened. She had witnessed everything from the start. And she couldn't stay silent any longer. Her voice came out as a whisper, but still reached the one person in charge. "He didn't do anything," Richard heard her. He whipped around, face flushed red, jaw clenched. His voice exploded, not even trying to sound professional anymore. "Keep quiet, unless you want to be fired." Emily froze. Her lips pressed together. She stepped back, lowered her head, and said no more. But in her eyes, shame had begun to grow. Right then, from the center of the room, a man in a black suit with slicked back hair stood up. Without many words, he raised his middle finger toward Kofi and said, loud and clear, "You don't belong here, go back to where you came from." The word slammed down like a hammer on marble. No one stopped him. No one intervened. Cruelty no longer needed disguises. And yet, Kofi didn't flinch. Surrounded by sneers and humiliation, he didn't back down. He lifted his head. His eyes locked onto the man who had just shouted. Not in rage. Not in protest. But with a stillness that was almost frightening. And then he spoke, slowly, clearly, as if addressing everyone in the room. "I know who I am, and what about you?" A heavy silence fell over the restaurant. Some blinked. Some looked away, like they'd been caught looking into a mirror. Just then, a loud bang echoed from the far corner. An older man, dressed in a brown suit and dark silk tie, shot up from his seat. His voice wasn't loud, but it was firm, heavy. "If he's not leaving, then I will." He dropped his napkin to the floor. The final glance he gave Kofi held no rage, only contempt. Not toward Kofi, but toward the people who had allowed him to remain here this long. And he walked away. No one stopped him. No one tried. The room grew even colder. And Kofi still stood there. Not defeated. Not fighting. Not leaving. Only silence remained, strong, calm, and completely beyond their understanding. After all the insults, the contemptuous glances, and the silent complicity of the crowd, Richard seemed to lose all patience. He marched straight toward Kofi, face flushed, eyes blazing like someone whose personal pride had just been wounded. Without another word, he pointed toward the door, his voice hissing through clenched teeth, "Out. Now." That command no longer sounded like a manager maintaining decorum. It was the order of someone clinging to power, desperate to erase a presence he couldn't tolerate. The two security guards understood immediately. They moved in closer. No longer passive like before, one of them reached out, ready to grab Kofi's shoulder, prepared to drag him out like a disruptive object. Kofi didn't flinch. He didn't pull back. He simply tilted his body slightly and brushed the guard's hand aside with a calm, firm motion. His voice was deep and strangely serene, "No need to touch me." The guard hesitated. Not out of fear, but because that calmness stripped away any justification to act. In the midst of that tense standoff, Something unexpected happened. From table 3, a man in a white dress shirt holding a glass of red wine stood up and walked over. He stopped right next to Kofi, offered a slight smirk, and without warning, tilted his hand and threw the entire glass of wine in Kofi's face. The bright red liquid splashed across Kofi's forehead, cheek, and collar. For a second, the room froze. Then the laughter erupted, loud and crude. The laughter of people convinced they had won. Someone at another table clapped. A few others whistled like they had just witnessed a brilliant act. No one called it an assault. No one questioned it. Kofi lifted his hand to his face. Drops of wine ran down his chin and neck. He didn't shout. Didn't step back. Didn't even look at the man who threw it. He just reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a handkerchief, and slowly wiped each streak. His forehead. His cheek. His neck. Not a single word. Not a single unnecessary move. And that disturbed them more than any punch would have. A woman in a green dress near the walkway turned to her friend and whispered, voice low but laced with disdain, "He's too afraid to react. Doesn't want to end up on the internet." A few nods. A few mocking looks. No one realized, his silence wasn't fear. Meanwhile, Richard leaned in toward the hostess. His voice dropped, but his eyes remained sharp with fury. "Call the police." The hostess's hand trembled slightly as she picked up the desk phone. She said nothing, just followed the order. Kofi stood still. He heard it all. The shouts, the laughter, the whispers, and now the final command. But he didn't turn around. Didn't look at anyone. He reached into his pants pocket and pulled out his phone. Not to call. Not to record. Just to send one single message. His fingers moved quickly. Calmly. Without hesitation. One message. One recipient. One decision. And no one in the room had any idea what had just been set in motion. Only Kofi knew. And only he fully understood, patience has a limit. And that limit had just been reached. Less than a minute after Kofi sent his brief message, the phone inside Richard's vest pocket suddenly vibrated. The ringtone broke the elegant quiet of Le Meridian Prime like something that simply didn't belong. No one else paid it much attention, but Richard froze in place. He pulled the phone out. It was an unknown number. No name appeared. But instinctively, he knew this wasn't an ordinary call. He brought the phone to his ear. Barely had it touched when a voice on the other end snapped, low and hard, with the kind of pressure that made Richard's temples go cold. "Do you realize who you just insulted?" No greeting. No small talk. Just one line, dense with gravity, cold and sharp with authority. Richard stood paralyzed. He mentally replayed the words, not quite believing what had just been said. His eyes widened. His face lost its color. His tongue went dry. His throat locked up. I don't understand, who is this, who's calling?" But the call had already ended. Not another word. The silence left behind was heavier than the voice that preceded it. He lowered the phone. It was still in his hand, but no longer felt like something he controlled. His fingers started to shake. Not from fear of the voice, but because something inside told him, he had made a very serious mistake. Across the room, at the far left corner of the dining area, Emily still stood silently, her eyes following every moment. She had witnessed the invisible blows Kofi had endured. She had heard the cruel words, had seen how he was surrounded and quietly exiled from the space as if it were inevitable. But now, something in her chest tightened. She discreetly pulled her phone from her apron pocket. Her fingers trembled slightly as she typed into the search bar, "Kofi, Hoodie, San Francisco." The results appeared almost instantly. She blinked, scrolling quickly through headline after headline. Kofi Mensah, the anonymous tech genius, the man behind the AI network Neuronet, the private black billionaire with a global investment empire. Emily inhaled deeply. Her expression changed. From helplessness to shock, and from shock to understanding. She lifted her gaze toward the table where Kofi was sitting. And in that moment, for the first time, she saw it clearly. The only person who didn't seem out of place in this room, was him. A few tables away, an older guest with silver hair, someone who had quietly chuckled when Kofi walked in, was now staring at his phone screen. His face had gone pale. His hand shook as he stared at a photo of Kofi from a Forbes interview 3 months ago. His eyes shifted from disbelief to fear. He quickly closed his phone, avoiding eye contact with Kofi, then turned away like a man realizing he'd just said something that could never be taken back. As for Richard, he looked frozen in time. The red flush on his face had faded into a stark whiteness. His hand clenched the phone tight. His lips moved soundlessly. "It can't be," the words he had thrown at Kofi now echoed back inside his mind. Every command, every gesture, every insult. He tried to swallow, but his throat locked up. The air around him grew thick. He could feel the weight of everyone's eyes. No one spoke. No more laughter. No more clinking glasses. The restaurant fell into an eerie stillness. A silence like stone. No one dared ask questions. No one dared film. All that remained was the image of a black man, seated in the center of a luxurious restaurant, wearing a simple hoodie, with a stain of wine still damp on his collar. Kofi sat there quietly. His hands folded. His eyes lowered toward the table. But there was no defeat in him. On the contrary, his presence was calm, composed, chillingly aware. He didn't need to do anything. He didn't need to shout. He didn't need to prove himself. His silence now was the loudest voice in the room. A stillness so powerful, it made those who once mocked him, begin to panic from within. While the restaurant remained cloaked in a heavy silence, the large glass door suddenly swung open. The chime echoed softly, yet for some reason, it startled more than a few guests. A man stepped inside. No one needed to ask who he was. A perfectly tailored navy blue suit, a silk tie the shade of ash, eyes sharp as blades, and a stride with not a hint of hesitation. That was Michael Grant, regional director of the entire LE Meridian Prime chain. Every eye in the dining hall seemed to gravitate toward him. But he didn't care. He didn't greet anyone. Didn't smile. Didn't play the role of a courteous gentleman. He walked straight ahead, passing by confused stares and the very faces that had moments ago sneered and hurled insults. His eyes locked on Richard, who stood frozen in place like a man struck by thunder. Michael stopped just one step in front of him. No small talk. No formalities. His voice was deep, firm, and heavy with authority. "Who did you just throw out of the restaurant?" The question was simple, but its tone carried an unmistakable threat. Richard instinctively straightened his posture, but his voice grew small. His hands still trembled, though he tried to hide it. He answered like reciting a rehearsed excuse, even as he realized how hollow it sounded. A stranger. Wearing a hoodie. No reservation. Michael narrowed his eyes, glaring directly at him. His tone sharpened, more intense. That stranger was Kofi Mensah. That name pierced the center of the room like a dagger. No one laughed anymore. No one dared move. Richard's face turned to stone. His eyes widened as he repeated the name, as if needing to confirm an unbearable reality. Billionaire Kofi Mensah, CEO of Neuronet. His voice was frail. His lips dry. The phone in his hand now seemed forgotten. Michael didn't respond. He simply stared at Richard like one looks at a staff member who had just destroyed the reputation of the entire restaurant chain in less than half an hour. Around them, the very chairs suddenly felt heavier. The guests who had once laughed with contempt, who had taken photos and videos, who had spoken with prejudice, now exchanged confused looks. Some quickly closed their phones, erasing footage. Others avoided Kofi's gaze, as if just waking from a delusion. An elderly woman, who had muttered how unpleasant earlier, no longer dared to meet anyone's eyes. A young man, the one who had raised his middle finger, now fumbled for his napkin, wiping his mouth as he stared down at a tasteless plate. In this moment of stillness, only Kofi remained unchanged. He still sat at his table, his back resting gently against the chair. His clothes still damp with wine. No one saw him flinch. No one saw him angry. Kofi slowly lifted the wine glass before him. His fingers held it gently, yet firmly. The deep red wine shimmered under the soft golden light from above. He scanned the room, not hurriedly, not with resentment. Just long enough for each person to understand exactly how wrong they'd been. And just how wrong. His gaze landed on Richard. Then, his voice rose. Not loud. Not harsh. But crystal clear, sharp, and precise like a thin blade. You messed with the wrong one. A short sentence, yet it plunged the entire restaurant into stunned silence. This time, it wasn't the silence of bystanders. It was the silence of people who had just realized they'd made a mistake that couldn't be undone. The room still hadn't recovered from the shock. No one dared to move. No one even dared to breathe too loudly. The silence now was no longer confusion. It was realization, the consequence of eyes that had once looked down on another. Michael, still standing in front of Richard, didn't lower his voice or hold back his fury. He looked at the longtime manager as if staring at the greatest failure of his entire career. You just cost this company its biggest investment, he said, voice sharp, void of any sympathy. Richard looked like he was about to collapse. His shoulders slumped. His lips trembled as he struggled to speak. I didn't know. I couldn't have guessed. The words fell into the air, weightless and meaningless. No one cared anymore for a last-minute excuse. At that moment, Kofi slowly rose from his chair. He didn't rush. Didn't make any dramatic move. But as he stood, every pair of eyes turned toward him, not with disdain or suspicion this time, but with silence and bowed heads. He didn't look around. He simply looked at Richard. His voice remained calm and steady, no louder than before, but now clearer than ever. I don't need to be recognized. I need to be respected. The words sliced through the air of the restaurant. Short, clear, but striking deep into everyone present. Just then, a male guest from the VIP table, the one who had remained silent all evening, stood up. His face was serious. No longer holding his head high, he slowly walked toward Kofi and bowed slightly. I'm sorry for everything we allowed to happen here. No one told him to do that. But his action led others to follow, one by one lowering their gaze. The pride from earlier was nowhere to be found. Emily, still standing behind the counter, could no longer hide her emotion. She stepped forward, her voice small but tight in her throat. I'm sorry for not standing up for you sooner. Kofi turned to her. His eyes softened. He nodded gently. No scolding. No comfort. But that one nod was enough for Emily to know she had finally done the right thing, even if late. Kofi turned back to Richard. No hatred. No arrogance. Just a deeply human look, the kind you give when you've understood life more than most ever will. Sometimes, the mistake doesn't come from actions, but from prejudice. There was no need to explain. No need to repeat it. Everyone heard. And everyone understood. Michael didn't say anything else. He just turned to the hostess and nodded. Richard is terminated, effective immediately. A quiet thunderbolt in a room already shattered. No one protested. No one was surprised. Everyone knew, it was inevitable. Richard stood there, stripped of all the power he once held. He didn't react. He didn't plead. He just bowed his head. And for the first time, he truly felt what it meant to lose power, simply because he had judged the wrong person. Kofi walked slowly toward the door. No rush. No looking back. And the entire restaurant was silent. No clinking glasses. No whispered gossip. Everyone just watched as that figure disappeared from view. As if they were witnessing something falling away from the pride they once held so tightly. A late apology. A powerful lesson. And a silence that forced everyone to quietly reckon with themselves. Just hours after Kofi left Le Meridian Prime, what happened inside the restaurant began to spread across social media. The video, captured from table 7 on a shaky phone camera, was blurry and unpolished, but clear enough to show every word, every stare, every reaction. Headlines flooded every platform: a black billionaire kicked out of a restaurant he invested in. There was no need for sensationalism. No clickbait. Just a truth, raw, unjust, and painfully clear, that struck a nerve with everyone. Within 24 hours, the video reached 10 million views. Those who had stayed silent began to speak out. Those who had once been indifferent started to share. And those who believed power always came dressed in luxury now began to understand that sometimes it only takes someone sitting in silence for the entire world to pause and reflect. Kofi didn't shout. Didn't retaliate. Didn't slam the table. But it was his calm, his steady gaze, and that final quiet smile that turned him into a symbol of a new kind of power, a silent power, undeniable and profound. And all of it came down to a single sentence, delivered at the perfect time, to the perfect audience, in the perfect setting: "You messed with the wrong one." The quote spread like wildfire. Printed on t-shirts. Turned into hashtags. Reused as video titles. A silent warning to anyone who still believed prejudice was a thing to overlook. But the public reaction didn't stop there. Le Meridian Prime was forced to release a public apology, but it was too late. The entire chain temporarily suspended operations across the West Coast to review internal procedures. In truth, it was the gentlest way to describe the fallout from one manager's unforgivable mistake. While many were reeling, one person walked away with growing respect: Emily. The young woman who had bowed her head and apologized to Kofi, the one who had spoken up when everyone else fell silent, was invited to become the new branch manager in Los Angeles. Not because she saved anyone, but because she dared not to turn away. As for Richard, he left Le Meridian Prime with no send-off. Within just a few nights, every job offer he'd once had vanished. Those who once praised his strict professionalism now firmly shut their doors. No one stood by him. No one called his name. A reputation built over decades now crumbled in silence. And Richard, more than anyone, understood, what brought him down wasn't a loss of control, it was the loss of humanity. During all the chaos, Kofi never appeared. He didn't live stream. Didn't grant interviews. Didn't hold a press conference. He posted only one tweet. Short. No tags. No hashtags. No explanation. No fanfare. Just white text on a black background: "Respect should be the standard, not the reward." Respect, it's not something to be handed out. Not a prize reserved for the rich, the famous, or the familiar. It should be a given. A default. Never something anyone should have to beg for. And this time, without a hashtag, the world still nodded in agreement. Not because he was a billionaire, but because he was right. 1 month after the incident at Le Meridian Prime, the name Kofi Mensah appeared on the headline of the Tech and Humanity Conference, one of the year's most prestigious tech events, gathering global leaders, scholars, and innovators. Kofi walked onto the stage wearing a minimalist suit. No brand labels. No flashy accessories. He didn't walk like a celebrated icon, but like an ordinary man, though each step carried the presence of someone who had walked through invisible wounds. The stage lights dimmed. The audience fell into a breathless silence. He didn't open with accolades or job titles. He didn't speak of success or technology. Instead, he began with a story, one that seemed small. A dinner that never happened. A seat denied. A full-body stare. A glass of wine thrown in his face. A restaurant he had invested in, but was treated as a stranger. Kofi recounted that experience in an even, gentle voice. No resentment. No blame. Yet each word seemed to wrap the entire hall in quiet reflection. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. It was the calm in his tone that held the room captive. Then he paused. His gaze fell to the front row, where billion-dollar CEOs sat in tailored suits. His face didn't show anger. Nor unease. Just clarity, precision, and truth. Then he spoke. His voice low, every word landing like a knock on the conscience of every person listening. I don't need to be treated special. I need to be treated fairly. No one spoke. No applause. No coughs. The entire hall fell into an eerie stillness, as if everyone had been pulled into a silent space where they had to face themselves. That silence didn't come from admiration. It came from quiet shame. After a breath, Kofi continued. Not long. Not complex. But sharp enough to chill. True power doesn't shout. It arrives quietly. There was no arrogance in that statement. It sounded more like a reminder, gentle, but impossible to ignore. Kofi bowed his head. He didn't wave. He didn't linger. He stepped off the stage slowly, upright, and at peace. Behind him, the hall remained frozen. No whispers. No one stood. It was as if something very simple, but long forgotten, was still echoing in the room. Within hours, the speech was shared everywhere. From YouTube to podcasts. From Twitter to TED Talks. The media didn't label it an inspirational speech. They called it a necessary wake-up call in an era of silent prejudice. Kofi didn't say much. But it was enough for the world to finally listen. And this time, no one dared to look away. Kofi's story wasn't just a one-time incident in a luxury restaurant. It was a mirror held up to a quiet, persistent truth that exists everywhere: prejudice. Not everyone carries it in their heart, but many carry it in their gaze, in their reactions, in their silence when a voice is most needed. Kofi didn't walk in as a CEO. He didn't enter with the label of billionaire, or a team of assistants, or a luxury car waiting at the curb. He walked in like any ordinary person, like any one of us. And just because of that, he was denied, mocked, and belittled. What moved millions wasn't the moment his true identity was revealed. It was the way he remained composed in the middle of a storm. He didn't lash out. He didn't retaliate. He didn't pull out a business card or shout to assert his rights. He simply stood still, wiped his face, and sent a text. True strength doesn't need noise. It shows in how you choose to keep your dignity when others try to strip it from you. And when the truth finally came out, everyone's gaze shifted. But the sad part is, respect only arrived after they found out who he was. That should make us think. How many of us, if not rich, not famous, not successful, would still be treated as human beings with equal worth? The words "I don't need to be treated special. I need to be treated fairly" weren't just for Kofi. They were for the server who gets shouted at, for the quiet guest in the back row, for anyone who's ever been misjudged simply for not fitting in. And maybe, what makes the world better isn't powerful people showing up at the right time. It's ordinary people, like Emily, who choose to speak up when everyone else stays silent. Respect should never be a reward for success. It should be the default, as long as you're human. If you believe the story is worth spreading, don't forget to share the video, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel, so together, we can keep amplifying these human values that have the power to change the world, one small action at a time. Remember, every time you stand for fairness, you're helping build the kind of world you'd want to live in.